Welcome back to the Stuff About Money They Didn't Teach You in School podcast. I am Eric Garcia, certified financial planner, your host for today. And I have a guest on, John Hupalo. John is from My College Corner. He's kind of been in the college planning space for a while. We were joking before we hit record, John. We just need a standing meeting for us to podcast. I think you are going to be maybe the most regular guest on my podcast.
Wow. Well, thanks, Eric. Yeah, I love talking to you. And this is a topic this is an area where there's no shortage of things to talk about. So whenever you want to chat, I'm more than happy to. It's always great fun. And I hope your listeners and those who are listening to the podcast get a lot out of this. It's really important to me that we try to get the word out as best we can. And I just love the forum that you have. So let's go do it.
My youngest is in fifth grade, so that means that I have at least probably another 11 years of recording with you until she's out of college. So this is a purely selfish show. But let me actually do a better job of introducing you. You've been in the college planning space for 20 plus years, and correct me if I'm wrong, your co-founder at My College Corner was one of the pioneers in the 529 space, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was an expert in private credit student loans, kind of grew up in that area. I was actually the chief financial officer of a publicly traded student loan company that didn't do so well during the financial crisis in 2007 and 8, but that's a different story. But Peter Mazareas, who is the co-founder, he was at the Massachusetts Educational Financing Authority, executive director there, just took over. I came in and said, hey, let's do all this. And as it turned out, MIFA had a platform where they were not only responsible for student loans, private credit student loans in Massachusetts, and using their tax exempt status to make it better for students and for families when they're borrowing. They also had a charter for savings. And Peter and a group of others, Mary Morris in Virginia and a few others across the country, got together and said, let's kind of really blow out this idea of prepaid college plan. Let's make it a savings program. And they went and they lobbied the Congress, and they're still at it today, Eric. There's always more work to be done. It's very cool.
In fact, we met in person. I think it might have been one of y'all's meetings down here in New Orleans, and we finally had a chance and had a lovely conversation down in the French Quarter.
Yeah, that's right. That was a great morning. I was really glad that we could get together. And again, there's plenty to talk about. And the College Savings Foundation has been at it now 20 years as well, trying to make it better. And the reality is try to expand the utility of that program. It's a great program, but they've expanded it and made it even better.
Man, so I am so grateful for you taking time and bringing your experience and knowledge to our listeners. And quite frankly, I've leaned on you a little bit. So here's the format for today. We're going to talk about FAFSA. FAFSA is changing. It's changed. We just don't know how, or we know a little bit how. We haven't seen it yet, right? So we want to talk about some updates on FAFSA. And then if we can talk a little bit about 529s, how they work, some of the changes in the 529 space. But I imagine we'll touch on 529s during the conversation. But before we jump into FAFSA, there's two things that I want to mention. Number one, I want to mention on the front end, just in case, listeners, you don't make it to the end. John has a blog that was posted on mycollegecorner.com. It's the latest blog, November 2nd. It says, Parents Know the College Admissions Timeline. This is probably hands down one of the most informative pieces I've read as a parent on college planning. You essentially lay out a timeline from freshman year to senior year, what students and parents should be doing.
Yeah, that's right, Eric. And I'm just thrilled that you found it so useful, because this is the kind of content that we're trying to create. Because what you said here is really critical. The college planning process does not start senior year. It really starts freshman year for students. So we wanted to lay that out, give folks a chance. And I think, a lot of when you really look at where you are in your life stage and where your kids are, most of them are in pretty good shape, but they get scared by what they don't know. So we thought, let's just put it out there and say, here's what you can be doing. In freshman year, you don't have to worry about filing the FAFSA form, right? You just have to know kind of it exists.
Join clubs, take leadership roles.
Yes.
I love how you lay that out.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you liked it. And we love it. MyCollegeCorner.com, by the way, it's all free information there. We put up some webinars on a whole bunch of topics. There are blog articles and there are some tools there. So I hope that your listeners will check it out and tell us what they like and what we might be able to improve.
And we're going to link all of this stuff in the show notes. So you don't have to write it down if you don't want to. But Check it out. Super helpful. The second thing I want to say is before we hop into the FAFSA, I crowdsourced some questions for this episode. Okay.
Cool.
College planning. I'm at that stage where a lot of my friends have kids, a lot of my Facebook friends have kids. And obviously, as a financial planner, I'm running a group of financial planners where we get a lot of these questions. So I've crowdsourced some stuff. And I want to start off with it's like a pre-FAFSA question. I actually think this is probably maybe the most important takeaway of this entire podcast. I'm going to read the question exactly how it was posted to me. Okay. This is what they say. They say, how do I professionally say to my kid, I had to take out loans. So do you do, so I'm sorry. So do you. I'm sorry all your friends are rich or have parents who work at Tulane. So here's the situation. I'm not paying for college. It's let me rephrase the question a little different way. How do we have this conversation with our kids about who's paying for college?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. When you talk about stuff about money, this is the stuff about money that could be one of the first times, outside of having a kid having an allowance, but this is the first adult decision that they're really going to make. And a lot of times, Eric, there's this debate in the house. We had in our house too. It's like, well, whose decision is this? Right. And is it the kid's decision where they want to go to college, the parents deciding? Well, the reality, it's a little bit of like a real negotiation, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's critical, really critical, that financial fit is in that equation, right? And if you go to your like high school counselors, they'll tell you straight out, hey, for us, a happy student is one where the academic and social fit is really good. And then I'll say to them, well, yeah, what about like, can they afford it? Right? That's like a big deal. So I think that this is a really critical time. And, talk about when can you start that conversation? If you can start it sooner, it's better because, you went through this. I went through this twice with my daughters. By the time senior year comes around, there's so much emotion like into that equation. It's kind of crazy, right? And for all the reasons we know, particularly the first one out of the house, it's not only where college you're going to go to, it's my baby's leaving the nest, right? And the kid has that sort of same kind of anxieties. Oh, I'm going to be leaving soon. And, so there's all this stuff going on and it gets really emotional. So if you can start having that conversation in freshman, sophomore year, say to your student, look, we want to have a great result here, but here's what it's going to be. How well do you do in school? Like, how does it fit socially for you? And by the way, it's expensive. So let's just talk about that, and for some families, you don't have to be like crazy rich to like save, what I always say, saving $1 today is better than borrowing one tomorrow for college, right? Yeah. So even, freshman year, sophomore year, even junior year, whatever you can sort of pack away just a little bit will probably reduce the amount of debt that would be required if it's required on the back end. So have that conversation. It's not easy, but the sooner you can get into that, the more likely you are to actually be able to affect the decision when it comes to be the time.
And I do find the decision on who's paying, student or parents, I tend to find it's a values-driven decision that people have this sense like I was the born of immigrant parents. And if there's anything about immigrants, they value education and they will second and third and fourth mortgage their property for their kids to get a good education. I'm like, man, like I'm going to pay for my kids' college if I can, but like, let's make sure it's reasonable. Let's sure it makes sense. So it is a bit of a values conversation. So engaging it early on is good.
Yeah, and I think having eyes wide open is really important. Some people are railing against college debt. I'm actually, and it's not because I spent a good part of my career in the private credit student loan space, but I have now evidence, like data, which we like to talk about data in financial services, right? There's evidence that kids who graduate with, I'm going to say, a reasonable, smart amount of debt will do really well. And for this reason, I was talking to friends of mine about this when we were going through the process. And lo and behold, I said, look, for both of my daughters have student loans, right? And I co-signed them and I made sure that, if they were going to be in trouble, I could help them, but they were fine. They didn't need the help. Some kids do that's great. But one of my friends sent me a snapshot of his son's FICO score 2 years out of school, 740. And for your listeners who maybe doesn't mean a lot to them, that's a really solid credit
Yeah.
score. Like 850 is the highest, and a lot of people have way under 700. And so a 740 FICO score for somebody 2 years out. And I'm not taking full credit or any credit for that, but it's like the kid had a loan, they did what they were supposed to do. They started paying their utility bills on time, and they had a great FICO score within a couple of years of being out of school. So they set themselves, the foundation for their financial future was set very solidly.
So let me ask you this. You said a reasonable amount of student loan. Now, I've always used the rule of thumb. A reasonable amount is your first year's anticipated income, whatever you're going to go do, right? If you're going to be
Right.
an engineer, maybe with 85,000 of student loan debt, it's going to be good. If you're going to go be the executive director at a small nonprofit, then you probably don't want $250,000 of law school debt, right? Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable metric. I say the same thing, but I also, and this is another one of my, saving a dollar today is better than borrowing tomorrow. The other one that I really will say as many times as I possibly can is that student loans should be the last resort, not the first option to pay for college. So there are lots of arrows in that quiver, and hopefully the loan arrow comes last. There's some savings the family might have. There's financial aid available. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. Third-party scholarships or other scholarships, and then sometimes payment plans. The reality is, and you saw it, I saw it when my daughters went to school. I had more disposable income because they weren't around asking me for money or taking the car and putting, or eating or whatever they were doing. But even if it's $25 a month or $50 a month, every school says at the beginning of the year, how do you want to pay for this? And by the way, here's this payment plan, right? So you can pay over 10 months or 6 months or whatever you want. And even if it's $1,000 or whatever it happens to be, where a family's comfortable, that's better than taking $1,000 more in loan and paying the interest on that and all the rest of it. So there are a whole bunch of arrows in that quiver, and just think about it in those terms. Like, what is the package? What's the best way for me to use my current resources and what's going to come to actually pay the college bill when it's time?
We talked about that specific issue, I think, in our second show that we did. So
That's
I'll
right.
post links to that as well about the quivers. But let's hop into the FAFSA.
Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier about parents having a lot of money and being able to afford college. So first question I want to ask you is what is the FAFSA? Who should fill it out? And if you have money, should you even bother filling it out?
Yeah, great. So FAFSA, one of the things we're going to post another article on mycollegecorner.com, maybe today or Monday. It's going to be like all the terms and acronyms you need to know, right? And so FAFSA is like at the top of the list. It's the free, really underline, free application for federal student aid. FAFSA, that's the acronym, free application for federal student aid. And what this does is allows the Department of Education to collect financial information from both the parent and from the student. And we'll talk about dependent students there, because there's, like, when you start on the branches, it gets kind of crazy. But let's just talk about dependent students. So they're going to be undergraduates, and they need some to file this form to be considered for federal financial aid. So the question then that you ask is, okay, well, what could they be eligible for, and is it worth doing, right? So the eligibility criteria is run through an algorithm, right? A fancy word for an equation. And they take the parent's income, they take the student's income, savings from both of them, other assets. And at the very end of all this, they produce a number called the Student Aid Index. And
the Student Aid Index is new. That replaces the EFC, the expected family contribution. That's going away.
That's good. That has gone away. Gone away.
Okay.
That's gone away. So that's in the rearview mirror. Somebody like you already filled out a FAFSA in the past and got an EFC. You're going to see a whole new experience when you get on here. And by the way, the sort of the bottom line on all this is that this form had previously been available on October 1st. It is not yet available at the Department of Education's site. In December, it's going to come out. There's guidance that came out 2 days ago, and those of us who follow this, and I follow this way too closely, I got a big chuckle and try to make a little bit of fun about it. But they said it's going to be posted before December 31st. So that was very helpful.
That means January 2nd.
Well, no, so this is the whole thing, Eric. They said it's going to be before December 31st, 2023. So I thought, okay, so it's going to be this year. But previously they were talking about how it's going to be sometime in December. And like, that's just so vague. But the point of this, and this is really critical, and this is why I think we need to get focused on this, is that form determines a student's eligibility for work study, for Pell Grants and other grants that the federal government provides on a need base. So those who have lower incomes, they're going to get more Pell Grants, really critical for that population. And also for federal student loans. So the federal direct student loan program, in my estimation, is the best game in town for an undergraduate student, right? They're really favorable repayment terms. They're doing a lot of stuff. We can spend the whole show just talking about that one day. But the point of all this is that it's critical for students to fill out this form. And at mycollegecorner.com, under the tools sections, we have what is called the Financial Aid Calculator Student Aid Index Estimator. The Department of Education put out very good, strong guidance over the course of the last year about how they're going to do this calculation. And although it's not an official link, I can't say like this is what your essay is 100% going to be. It's a really good estimator. We've had almost 20,000 people use that since it was up there on September 1st. So I really encourage people, while you're waiting for this FAFSA form to officially be available sometime in December, you can go up, check out what your SAI would be. For those who are going to do that, you'll need information from your 2020 tax return. That's the one that drives all this. So 2 years ago, they call it the prior year. It's one of the definitions we'll have in that article that we put up, but it's 2 years ago. So it's very confusing, but you're applying for 2024-25. So the next academic year. So if you take 2024, subtract 2, you get to 2022, which is the tax year that all this information is. And by the way, once the government has their site open, there's going to be a direct retrieval tool. So the student's going to have to say, you know, my parent is going to also supply information, and then they're going to contact the parent to give them access in.
Okay, so you bring up a good point here. So who's responsible for completing the form? Is it the student or the parent?
The student.
The student's responsible. Okay.
Yeah, they're putting their big boy pants on now, Eric. It's like, okay, you know, this is your first real financial transaction. I mean, they apply to college, right? I'm not applying for my daughter, right? My daughter applied. Same thing with financial aid. They're applying for themselves. So they have to take the lead. I'm going to say you don't have to be a helicopter parent to be the one sitting right next to them when they're pushing all the buttons. It's like most of us do that, right? And it's kind of daunting for a high school senior who hasn't been through any of this before. Now all of a sudden they're going to start dealing with the IRS data retrieval tool and all the rest of this. It's a real push.
So I mean, if the IRS is, or if part of education is making them fill it out, then they shouldn't need my data. Why are they going to base my kid's need based off of, if it's their responsibility, they're going to base it off of my financials. So I'm saying that tongue in cheek, obviously.
Sure.
So when they complete it, there's a point along the way where they're going to need to, obviously the student is going to need to involve the parent to get access to tax
the
return
parent's
information.
data. Yeah,
right?
that's right. That's right.
And am I understanding this correctly, that it is going to now be automatic? It's not going to be an option whether to tie directly to the IRS. It's going to be an automatic thing, right?
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. It's going to be an automatic tie, which I think honestly is what's taken this big tie up and delay. Getting that right with the IRS. You can imagine all the security and all the rest of it. Yeah, it's a huge thing. So yes, so that's it. But you know, as your listeners are going, they ought to jot this down as well. If you're going to go in there, you need something called your FSA ID. That's your Federal Student Aid ID, which is basically your identifying number. The student needs one and the parent needs one, and they're separate, right? So on our blog, we talk about 5 things that you can do before this form becomes available. We just hit on the second one. One is go up on the calculator and, you know, check out what your SAI might be. The second one is go to studentaid.gov. That's studentaid.gov. and create an FSA ID for the student. So they need to do this. And then the parent needs to do it as well. And the sort of good news here is, well, once you have an FSA ID, you can use that in years to come. It's used for all kinds of interactions with the Department of Education down the line. We can talk about all the rest of that another time, but it's really critical. So you could do that right now so that when the form is available, you'll have that hurdle will be jumped and you can sort of get through and start on the form.
So I'll use my ID. I'll use it for all of my kids. It doesn't
That's
change.
right. That's right.
It's kind of like my social security, my EIN for student
for
loan,
financial aid.
college stuff.
Yeah.
Financial
Perfect.
aid.
Yeah. Perfect way to think about it. Yeah.
So So kind of go back to the original question. So basically everyone should apply. Even if you know you're not going to qualify for any government aid, you should qualify.
You should file the form.
You should file the form.
We tell that's exactly right. And so the sort of two reasons for that, and you can get an idea on when you fill out the estimator. And one other point about the estimator, remember, this is not like the number that the government wants you to contribute for college. Right? That expected family contribution was like it was almost, it was not doing what the government expected it to do. When they first created that EFC thing, they just said, we want to let you know like what we think the relative range is. This student aid index is called an index for a reason. And the index can go from negative 1,500 all the way up to the cost of attendance. So if you have a wild, crazy amount of income and assets, you may, let's just say that the cost of attendance at a school is $50,000. Your student aid index might be 50,000. If you have very little or no assets, same thing for the student's student aid index might be negative 1,500. And so that's kind of counterintuitive, you know, and we wrote about this on another article there on the blog, but it's kind of counterintuitive, but it is an index now. So they're not saying that, you know, because you're less than zero, we're going to give you more money than you might be entitled. What that range index allows them to do is more aptly identify students who are eligible for Pell Grants. And the big driver behind this FAFSA simplification is this Pell Grant program. And Pell Grants allow lots and lots of kids who don't come from means to go to school, sometimes for free. Right. Mm-hmm. So this idea of like how much of a Pell Grant can you get is a really big deal. So there's relative indexes. Let's say I have a kid who has a 0 SAI and I have a student who's a negative 1,500 SAI. That's an indicator to the college financial aid office that the negative 1,500 student needs more aid. They both need aid, but if you're trying to like parse through these very scarce resources and you want the negative 1,500, that's the kid that should get more aid.
So that brings up a really good point. When I fill out the FAFSA, there's a couple things going on. One is if you complete it, the student's going to have access to government loans regardless. Or there's an amount of loan that every student can access regardless of need, correct?
Exactly right. Exactly right.
And it increases with every year. Like what, per semester as a freshman, it's like 4,000 or 4,500.
Yeah, so freshman and sophomore years, the first and second year, $5,500 total. And then it gets a little more confusing. There's subsidized and unsubsidized, but like just to get to the high level, $5,500 for freshmen and sophomores, $6,500 for juniors, $7,500 for seniors. That's the maximum you can borrow under the federal government program.
Which comes out to somewhere like right under 40,000 total, which is somewhere right around the average first year income for someone coming out of college.
Yeah, so I love that metric. Exactly right. We say that if you're borrowing that and you're making that amount, you should be able to do that comfortably.
So if you want to take advantage of any government loan, regardless of how much money you have, regardless of your net worth, you got to complete the FAFSA. You got to give the IRS. I mean, the IRS knows your finances already. You can't hide it. Submit it.
Okay? That's right.
And then also from a government standpoint, Pell Grants and whatnot will be determined by the SIA. But then you said something else that colleges, the individual college aid financial offices are going to use the number as well to determine their aid that they give to students, correct?
That's right. Yeah. And there's another group, scholarship providers and others who can get that SAI data, and they use it. Some state programs are dependent on the FSA, on the SAI index as well. So yeah, fill it out. I mean, particularly, you know, I did it with my daughter, and she was scared to hit that IRS button, and I didn't. First time I did it, I was like, all right, I'm holding my breath too.
I was scared to die. My kid didn't. He didn't care. I cared. I was terrified.
Yeah, of course. Well, you know, we're from the IRS and we're here to help you. You're like, that's not like resonating real well with me, but it worked, right? It worked really well. Yeah. So hopefully they have the kinks worked out of it in this next form. And I'm with you. Just file the form and see what happens.
So that brings me to the next question is we're filing this form as we plan as parents for our kid. Let's talk about how different assets impact our SAI.
Yes.
You know, everyone's trying. John, and I'm sure you've heard it. Like people will come up with wild ideas in terms of how to avoid um, reporting income or reporting assets in an effort to get more student money. I'm sitting here thinking like, wow, that is complicated and far fetched. And some of the ideas are not far fetched, but it just seems a lot of it just seems some of these ideas are interesting things that you wouldn't normally do that you're trying to do for for a few college bucks. So what's your thoughts on some of some of these ideas or ways to and I don't want to go into any specifics of
No,
the different types of strategies, but
no, and I appreciate that. And so my sort of bottom line on all of this, and you said it before, is the IRS now has your financial information, and it's going to automatically upload into this form, right? And so the question is, what can I do to game that system, right? And they're using your tax returns from 2 years prior. So that means once your student is a junior and senior, you're locked in. That's going to be your financial picture that the FAFSA form will use. And by the way, if it changes, and this is really critical for your listeners, I'm glad you brought this up. If it changes dramatically, there's a loss of a job or some terrible medical situation, you can appeal all that and make that happen and figure out how to make it right. But you need to get on that really early in the process, right? So I think it's important and critical that you're able to go through and determine early in the process. So you want to do all that. But like some of these schemes, somebody once told me, well, it's much better if you're in state somewhere. So I'm going to get the in-state tuition. Yeah. I'm going to buy my kid a condo in that state. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, but if you're able to afford a condo in that state, why don't you just just play it straight and see what happens.
Or give up guardianship to a poor grandparent.
Yeah, right. There are all those little games, and I don't think I can't like recommend people do that or spend a lot of time thinking about it. It's not very productive.
I feel like our tax returns tell a particular narrative about our finances. Then all of a sudden, if you're telling a different narrative, it's gonna be really hard to tell a different one now because if you file your taxes, you can pretty much file your FAFSA other than the formality of hitting go, right?
Right.
Another question I get often is, and I mentioned we're going to talk about 529 plans. Are 529 assets considered differently than investment accounts? So let's say, for example, someone has $100,000 in a taxable investment account, and then someone has $100,000 in a 529 plan.
Right.
And let's say that owner, let's say it's me, I own the 529 and I own the investment account. How are those assets counted? Are they counted differently?
Yeah, they are. And you obviously, if you've, like I did with my kids, we had 529s for both the girls. I had the benefit of tax deferral of all that income gain. Like I wasn't paying taxes on that account while they were little, and it was growing and growing and growing. And as long as you use it for what's known technically as a qualified distribution, qualified educational expense, then you don't pay tax on it ever, right? And so that grows. So fundamentally, it's a really good savings vehicle. But to get to your point, and this is one of the places that has really improved quite a lot on this new FAFSA form. So the new FAFSA form will say what's the same, what your college savings are on a 529 will assume like 5.64% of that will assume to be available for your child's education, right?
5.64%
of the 529 account. That's how they. Okay. Yeah. So, because there's this wild myth out there, and I think it's a wild myth that if I save too much for college, I'm going to be penalized big time in the financial aid process. And with the 529s, that's really not true. It's 5.64%. The taxable accounts are a higher amount, so they actually assume you're going to take more out of that account than 5.64%. So again, there's an advantage.
It seems backwards to me. It seems backwards to me because it seems like 100% of the 529 plan would be allocated towards college.
Yeah, but the way I think the differential here is that they're assuming that only 5.64%, because they don't want to penalize you in the 100%. If I have, in my example before, $50,000 cost of attendance, I have 50,000, and they say, okay, use all that, and then you've sort of drained your account on the first year. They didn't want that penalty, that to actually be a penalty against you for the financial aid. So there were two other really big improvements in the 529 treatment of 529s before. And when you filled out the FAFSA form last time, if there was a grandparent 529 involved, then what would happen is the grandparent would give that money to the student, and it would be considered the student's income, not savings, but student income, and it would be taxed from the financial. I say tax. I shouldn't say that in this context. It would have been assumed that 20% of that would be used for financial aid. So that would have a pretty significant reduction in the amount of financial aid, right, that you're getting. Instead of saying, you know what, for 5.64% on $10,000, it's $564 is how much less financial aid you'd get. If we're the grandparent pushing it through to the student, that would have been $2,000 less aid. So that was a place where, okay, you got to be really careful that, well, they took that restriction out, Eric. So now grandparent 529s count just like the other. It just get it in there and use it for a direct dollar for dollar. So that's great. And the second is that they used to ask whether or not you had a 529 for a sibling, like your whole 529. Now it's just right for that student. So they're really trying to focus on what's happening for that particular student. And they changed the formula so that the utilization of 529s is actually much more advantageous. They also changed the formula in a negative way. And I'll say this because it's connected. I just talked about siblings. And you're not going to appreciate this if you have a second child in school while your first one's still in college. But it used to be that your ESC would be divided by the number of kids in college, basically, right? So if you had two students, you had 10,000 EFC, it was 5,000 each. That's not the way it is anymore. They call it the sibling loophole has been closed. And they're saying, you know what, we're playing it straight with a kid. So we're not going to worry about reducing your student aid index. And by the way, it's an index now, not a contribution number. So, just relatively, you'll have to go to the school and see what this means.
So back to 529 plans, grandparent owned, parent owned. Yep. They're looking at the student. What are they a beneficiary of? So it doesn't matter who owns it. Are they the beneficiary of a 529 plan? And when a withdrawal is made, there's an election where the owner gets to say, is it made to the owner or to the student?
Right.
What's the correct way to do that?
Or maybe directly to the university or the college, right? Yeah. So it doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. I did it myself personally directly to the school. So there would be a good trail there. If anybody came back to me and said, well, how do we know that you use that money for qualified educational expenses? Because I sent the money directly to the college and, it showed up on the bill, minus amount from 529, and there's my documentation. So that's why I did that.
Yeah, it makes it easy if you ever
audited. Yeah, if you're ever audited, yeah.
Yeah. How are so we talked about 529 assets, taxable investment accounts. How's property looked upon? Maybe like a property in terms of like real estate, like primary home, and then some type of maybe secondary or rental property, and then also business asset.
Yeah, so this is another place where it's changed fundamentally and negatively for a parent. So the good news is your primary home is still your primary home and it doesn't count, right? So you don't have to worry about valuing your home or any of that. A second home could be an asset or for this purpose. And we're just talking about the FAFSA form here, the federal form. There's another form out there called the CSS profile where they really dig into this on a whole different level, but that's probably
specific colleges require that, not the majority, correct?
That's right. About 300 or so schools require that. It's through the College Board. So that's a separate form. But some of your listeners may have said, well, wait a minute, I thought I had to put some information in there. And they might have been filling out the profile rather than the FAFSA. So just kind of put a place saver there that there are two financial aid forms. Most students only have to file one, the federal form, but some of the colleges require the second form. So that's one thing about the property. The second, and this is where the sort of negative part of this comes in, they came back and said, well, look, if you have considerable assets, we're going to value them differently. And it's basically family farms and small businesses, right? So for those in the farm belt, saying we need to understand the value of your farm. We need a valuation of your farm that's going to be included in one as an asset in your financial aid calculation. And same thing for small business. There used to be a small business exemption, and it's been taken out basically. So this valuation question becomes one. And so, you were asking before, well, what might someone who's trying to game the system a little bit, like where could they do that? And this is clearly like, how are they going to audit what the value of your business is? And so again, I'm not saying that this is a strategy people should use. I'm just saying that this is one of those areas where honesty is the best policy. Like, let's say what it is and move into it and get through it. But I've already had this question come a number of times now. Well, how are they going to know? Well, there are relative ways to know. So you're saying you have they have a picture of what your financial wherewithal is throughout. And so this is an area, though, particularly on the valuation of family farms and small businesses, that's changed from the past.
Yeah, wow, valuing business is such a
yeah,
you have such wildly diverse values of the same business. So I guess that is the strategy, is you can discount the value of your business. I don't know. I will say this from a planning standpoint. If you have a kid who's preparing to go to college 2 years out, don't sell your small business that year.
Yeah.
Because that will drive your income. And
that's right. Hey, the last point we should make about this FAFSA form, it's just not for high school seniors, right? It's freshmen, sophomores, and juniors in college who are going to be returning for the next year. So they need to refile that form each year. So that's really important consideration as well.
So when the student, it's a good question. When the student, or leads me to this question, when the student goes to fill it out again, do I, as a parent, get notified like, hey, your student is completing the FAFSA and needs you to?
Yeah, same thing. They're going to knock on your door and say, okay, it's time for you to, by the way, this is a really interesting point. So they knock on your door and they say, all right, Eric, it's time for you to put your financial information in. You can say no, right? You can say no. And if you say no, the student will still be eligible for an unsubsidized student loan, but no other financial aid, right? So that, maybe that is something where a parent might say, you know what, I just don't want to do it, but I don't want them to necessarily be penalized. So, when they invite me, I'm going to say no. And then my student will be eligible at least for a federal student loan. But I'm thinking that most parents are going to say yes. Because you're going to want to know if you're eligible for work study or for any of the rest of it. So, but you have the option. They've kind of given you that opportunity.
What if a student is working, files their own tax return? Parents are, funding the student to some degree, but not claiming them as a dependent. Does that change how the FAFSA is filed?
It is. So dependent students and independent students are treated differently in the process. So if the student is independent, they can check that box and use a whole different route to be, I was going to say graded, but for the SAI calculation, it's a whole different calculation then, based just solely on their income and their assets.
So if a child is not a dependent on the parent's tax return, obviously they need to be working. Right. If they're not working, the question, the potential is, well, how are they being funded, right? But if the child has a legitimate job and is being paid, and parent no longer filing their own tax return, they could file their own quarter.
They could, but when I was a banker, I used to love it. I go to client meetings and they'd play Stump the Banker. So you just kind of playing Stump the Banker. I'm gonna give you a Stump the Banker question from this side of the microphone, and that is, which parent actually has to file, right? So a lot of situations where divorced, separated parents, that sort of thing, like who filed? Big question. And the answer to that is also different from the way it was on the last form. On this form, it's the parent that has provided the most financial support in the last 12 months. That's the parent who's supposed to file. So if my daughter's living with me, but my wife is the one who's supplying her financial support, doesn't matter that she's living with me. That's the way it used to be. Like, who are they living with? That's not it. Now it's who gives them more financial support in the last 12 months. So if my wife is out there making a ton of money and I'm holding, I have my house and my daughter's living with me, but she's getting support from her mother, it's not my financial return. It's her mom's financial return.
Even if you claim her as a dependent.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So are FAFSAs audited? Like,
they can be.
Like,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
yeah.
They can be. Yep. The department, and actually they did fairly substantial reviews on these at one point. Who knows what their capacity is, but yeah, no, they can definitely audit it. They can definitely audit it.
One of the best strategies for college planning. Let me see if I'm hearing this right. It's start saving.
I agree.
Yep. Don't try to manipulate the system and try to move income. You can do all that, but in the end, some of those schemes they fall through and they might cost more in the end. It's just be diligent and save. Read John's timeline so you know what your kids should be doing. We've been talking about needs-based
financial aid, right? Yeah,
needs-based financial, but there's also merit-based.
Correct.
Aid,
right,
which is not captured in the FAFSA.
Not
captured by kind of, it's the same way if I'm hiring someone, I'm not just going to hire them based off of, what degree that they have. I want to know, do they meet the culture of my workplace? Do they have, do they show leadership qualities? What extracurricular are they involved in? Right. And that is a good way to plan for colleges. Have conversations with your child about becoming a well-rounded individual when they're in the years that it's going to count towards aid.
Right. And in that article, we talk about, freshman year, look, get your feet planted, understand what it means to be a good high school student, study a lot, like do the best you can. Right. But also, as you're saying, join a club, join a sports team, do something in your community, just get involved, because what the colleges want is what you just said. And it's kind of their workplace, right? The students are there. They want a really well-rounded student body. They want athletes, they want, theater people, they want good citizens, and so they'll give merit money for that. And sometimes, and I'll tell you honestly, I might have mentioned this before, I love my daughter, but she's no Rhodes Scholar, but she got the same percentage of merit-based aid. We didn't file an application, nothing, from 3 different schools. So we lived in the Northeast. At the time, we lived outside of Boston. She got money from a school in San Antonio, one in the cornfields of Indianapolis, and one in the desert in California, all about the same percentage of the tuition, because I believe they wanted geographical diversity in their student population, right? So you're coming from Louisiana, and guess what? Maybe this kid wants to go to a school in Maine or someplace where a lot of kids from Louisiana don't show up, right? That school in Maine might say, oh, Eric's got his son. Well, we like this kid. We're going to give him some money just for coming from Louisiana, right? You don't know. And that's, you have no idea what the school wants. And you can think of it, and we should have mentioned this in the beginning. I think it's really critical that families realize that they are consumers. They're consumers of education, right? And there's a financial transaction that goes on between the consumer of the education and the institution. And the institution, a lot of us like to say, they're going to go there and they're going to be very maternalistic and they're going to take care of little Sally and it's all going to be, you know what? They want net tuition revenue. That's what colleges run by, net tuition revenue. So their game is to make sure they attract the best class they can and spend the very least amount of money they can to get that class in the seats, right? And that's kind of the equation between the consumer and the seller of the service.
So you're telling me colleges are in it for money?
Colleges are in it for money. Surprise.
Man, oh my goodness.
Can you imagine that?
Let's spend a couple minutes on 529 plans and wrap up there. There's been some big changes with 529 plans with I believe it's out of the Secure Act, the Secure 2.0 Act. Because the big question was, and I was posed this question recently, I got all this money in the 529 plan. My kid has scholarships. What am I supposed to do with this balance of money in my 529 plan? That was a big change. Talk to us a little bit about what happens there. This is pretty
Yeah,
cool.
and this is one of the places where the Congress gets a ton of credit, and honestly, the organizations like the one where we were in New Orleans, they've worked really hard to make these programs more useful to combat that thing of I don't want to save because I don't know if my kid's going to go to school. So now, and this is a course that's been rolled out over about the last 4 or 5 or 6 years. You can use money in your 529 account for private elementary, public school, private schools, elementary schools, high schools. So that's like a big deal. You can also use it for up to $10,000 for student loans, right? So we talked earlier about, well, gee, it's a good idea to go and get some loans. Well, if you have some money in there, you can use up to $10,000 of that to pay down the student loan. That's really great. Now, here's the key. You can use it for apprenticeships. On the Department of Education site, there's a whole list of different apprenticeships so that now if a kid wants to be a welder or they want to do something else and they're not going to college, and they want to get an apprenticeship, they can use that money for an apprenticeship. And then the sort of last like really big deal that you're alluding to is that they're now going to be able to roll these over into Roth IRAs, right? So, this is like really critical thing. Is like at the end of the day, and there's by the way, there's a lot of like detail around that, but the end of the day, it removes that whole argument of like what would happen, because previously what would happen is that there's a bunch of money left in the account, nobody else is going to school, and the parent had a couple options. One, they could redesignate the beneficiary, maybe to a grandchild or to themselves or to like whatever, or they could take the money out and there was a penalty that they could pay to get that out, right? So they had some options, but they were limited. Now you got these rollover opportunities. You can use it for student loans and all
The
the rest.
rollover
Right?
is to the beneficiary, not to the parent.
Right. You know what, Eric? I am not
I think it's
100%
I
sure
think it's
that.
to the beneficiary. You can use it for the child, not the
Yeah.
owner. I
Yeah.
believe so. There's a
I
limit on that. There's a top limit on how much of it you can roll over.
there is a limit, and there's a lot of like messy detail involved there, and so I'll get sharper on that point. I just don't want to guess wrong here. So I think you're right about that.
Because this is all new stuff.
Yeah, it's all new.
This is
Yeah.
all brand new stuff.
Yep.
Man, what are we missing, John? What's the silver bullet? Come on, man, make it. My daughter wants to go. She's a dancer, and all the colleges she's electing are in the Northeast. So I'm hoping they went geographic diversity.
Yep. Yeah.
Several are in New York, so she'll be knocking at your door.
Yeah. Excellent.
And I don't want to pay $80,000 for NYU, John.
Yeah, well, I'm a Stern MBA graduate, so I understand that. And if you come to New York, make sure you knock on my door because I'd love to have dinner with you and meet your daughter. So here's the silver bullet, and you said it at the beginning, and we talk about it all the time. Is just plan. Like, and it doesn't have to be like a 50-page strategic plan to get your kid into like ballet school. It just has to be, okay, here's how much money we saved. And I say this is the place where it's time to be realistic. Like, don't be optimistic about how much you think you're going to save or like what the market's going to do in the next 5 years to make you like crazy rich, and like be realistic. Like, what do you have? Know that. That's really important. And then start that conversation early with your son or daughter about, where do you think you want to go? And by the way, it's hard for parents. Like, here's how much money we have. Like, we've got this, and this is going to go. And so if you want to go to a school that's more expensive, we're going to be more dependent on either scholarships or need-based aid or something. And I'm going to say what's the opposite of the silver bullet? Like the thing you don't want to do?
Kryptonite.
Yeah, kryptonite. You don't want to blow up your retirement to get your kid to college, right? I think.
Say that again. Again.
Do not blow up your retirement to send your son or daughter to college. It's bad news to do that. Don't do it.
Thank you. I have never heard. I've been in this industry for 23 years, and I have yet to hear of a retirement loan.
There's no retirement loan.
No retirement.
No, once that
student loans. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, we are on the same hymnal on that one, Eric. No question.
Awesome, John. This is fantastic, man. I appreciate you. You are a value add to me personally. You're a value add to my listeners, and I'm sure we'll do this again sometime in the next 6 months.
Love to do it, Eric. Good luck. Great luck. Good news for everyone with that FAFSA form. It's going to be out sometime in December, so keep your eyes open.
We'll see. And just for record, we are recording on November 17th. right now, just kind of to put it in context. So
Yeah, perfect.
who knows? Who knows? All right, John, take care.
You as well.